April Fool, watch out at school. Here's a calendar, just like our calendar when we changed the calendar to April after March. Gilbert woke up and looked at the calendar. It was April 1st, April Fool's Day. He hopped out of bed and started filling his backpack with tricks to play on his friends. His sister Lola peeked in the door and said, "Knock, knock." Gilbert answered, "Who's there?" "April Fool," Lola shouted. Gilbert laughed and explained, "You're supposed to play a trick on someone, not tell jokes." "Okay," Lola said, "do a trick on me." But Gilbert didn't have any tricks to play on his little sister. He was already out the door. Gilbert met Patty on the corner as they walked to school. Patty suddenly said, "Watch out, Gilbert, your shoe's untied." Gilbert stopped to tie his shoe, but it was already tied. "Gotcha," Patty said. "April Fool." Gilbert laughed. He couldn't wait to try that trick on someone else. Principal Pug smiled and waved when he saw them this morning. "Good morning," he said. "Have a nice day." He was talking backwards. Day, nice have. Oops, I read it backwards. The bell rang, and Patty said, "Gilbert, hurry up. Let's go." Mrs. Bird was not smiling or waving. She said, "Put away your tricks so we can get started on our reading lesson. Gilbert, please turn to page 10. Gilbert stood up and read out loud. "Where is my book?" Sam asked. "I need it now." Mrs. Bird stopped him and said, "When someone reads out loud, it would be nice to know where the punctuation marks are." Then she said, "Here's an idea. When we come up to a period, say pop. And when you see a question mark, say pff. And a question mark can be huh? And an exclamation point can be boing. Try it." At the board, she has the word April upside down. Gilbert took a deep breath and started over. "Where is my book?" "Huh?" Sam asked. "Pop. I need it now. Boing." "Phew," Gilbert said. "This is hard," Louis said. "And it sure is funny. Boing." Everyone laughed. Mrs. Bird laughed too. "Thank you for being such a good sport, Gilbert." April Fool. Gilbert sat down and made a loud sound as he sat into his seat. "It wasn't me," he cried. "Somebody else put a whoopee cushion there." "Gotcha," said Louis. They finished their reading silently, but Gilbert kept thinking, pop, boing, whenever he said a period or an exclamation point. He also kept thinking about how he could play a trick on Louis. He had a hot, spicy gum in his pocket, so he turned to Louis and asked, "Would you like a piece of gum?" "No way," Louis said. Later, Gilbert put a plastic spider on Louis's desk when he wasn't looking. "This is so fake," Louis said as he handed it back. And then he slapped Gilbert on the back and said, "Your tricks are the worst." But Gilbert wasn't giving up. He still had a few more tricks up his sleeve. He also had a sign on his back that said, "I smell." No wonder everyone was snickering as he walked into the cafeteria. "Louis," grumbled Gilbert. Before he ate, Gilbert first checked his seat for a whoopee cushion. There was none. So he sat down and opened his lunchbox. Suddenly, he jumped out of his seat and yelled, "Ah! There's a worm in my apple." "It's just a gummy worm," Patty said. "And look, there's a note." The note said, "April Fool, signed, Mother." Gilbert couldn't believe it. Even his mother had tricked him. At recess, Frank said, "Watch out, Gilbert. There's a bee on your head." Gilbert swatted at his head while Frank laughed and said, "April Fools." Margaret said, "Watch out, Gilbert, your shoe's untied." Gilbert bent down to tie his shoe. "Made you look," Margaret said. Gilbert sighed. He couldn't believe he'd fallen for that trick twice in one day. Philip shouted, "Watch out, Gilbert!" But Gilbert wasn't going to get tricked again. "I'm not." Before he could finish, a kickball smacked him on the head. "I told you to watch out," said Philip. "I thought it was another trick," Gilbert groaned. But as he rubbed his head, "This is the worst April Fool's Day ever. Everybody's playing tricks on me, but I can't play a trick on anyone." "I told you your tricks were bad," Louis laughed. "Well, you'll never trick anyone." Gilbert said, "That's what you think, Louis. I have one more trick I've been saving just for you." Louis laughed and said, "What is it?" "I'm not telling you. You'll have to wait and see." Gilbert whispered to Patty what his trick was. Patty said loudly, "You're right, Gilbert. That's the best trick ever." Louis snorted and said, "You'll never fool me." There they are whispering, and then look closely at that picture. What kind of a ball is that? Is he kicking? Do you think that's the trick? Louis walked back into his classroom. Gilbert said, "Oh, Louis, let me hold the door for you." Louis asked if it was his trick. "No," said Gilbert. He held the door open and Louis walked in quickly. During spelling, Louis couldn't find an eraser. Gilbert said, "Here, Louis, you can borrow mine." Louis looked at the eraser and said, "Is this the trick?" "No," Gilbert said, but Louis inspected the eraser very carefully before using it. When they went to the art table, Gilbert pulled out a chair and said, "Here you go, Louis, have a seat." Louis looked at the chair and said, "It's a trick, right?" "No," Gilbert said, but Louis checked the chair very carefully for a whoopee cushion before he sat down. When Louis got up to clean his brushes, Gilbert said, "Be careful, Louis, your shoe's untied." "Ha!" Louis said, "I'm not falling for that old trick." But his shoe was untied, and Louis did fall when he stepped on his lace, and everyone laughed. "I told you it was untied," Gilbert said. "I thought it was your trick," Louis said, tying his shoe. "No, Gilbert, my trick is much better than that." During quiet time, Gilbert brought a book to Louis and said, "I think you should read this, Louis. I really like it." Louis wouldn't take the book. He said, "Is it a fake book? Is it glued shut? Is it going to squirt me when I open it?" "No," Gilbert said. "It's a really good book." Louis took the book, but he couldn't concentrate on the story. He kept looking over his shoulder to see where Gilbert was. That picture looks like George Washington, doesn't it? Louis was so busy watching for Gilbert, he didn't see Kenny putting a fake spider on his desk. Louis screamed when he saw it. "Gotcha," Kenny said. And when Patty told Louis his shoe was untied, he bent over to tie it. "Gotcha," Patty laughed. And then Louis sat on his own whoopee cushion, and Margaret said, "Gotcha." Everyone laughed. When the bell rang, Louis finally shouted, "I give up, Gilbert. I can't stand it anymore. Do your trick already." There he is. He's freaking out. Gilbert smiled and said, "There isn't any trick, Louis. I just made you think that there was. You got fooled." "Gotcha."